Some folks think poverty is measured in dollars, but I've lived long enough to know it's more often measured in the way a room goes quiet when you walk in the way eyes slide past you like you're something best not acknowledged, in the way a simple request can turn into a kind of spectacle you never meant to put on. It was a gray afternoon in a town that didn't bother with names on its welcome signs, just a stretch of hard-packed dirt and a handful of buildings that leaned into the wind like they'd grown tired of standing straight, and the kind of place where people knew each other well enough to decide who mattered and who didn't. Clara Whitcomb stepped down from the back of a supply wagon with care, her boots finding the ground like she wasn't entirely sure it would hold her, her skirt damp at the hem from a light rain that had come and gone without ever really settling the dust, and everything she owned tied up in a single canvas sack that had seen better years than most folks cared to admit. She paused there a moment, one hand resting on the side of the wagon as it rolled on without her. The driver already turned away, his job done, and there was something about the way she stood that might have gone unnoticed if anyone had been looking for it, a quiet steadiness, like she had learned a long time ago that the only thing a person could truly carry from one place to another was the way they held themselves when no one offered a hand. The town's general store sat just ahead, its wooden porch swept clean in neat lines that spoke of someone who believed order was the same thing as worth, and through the open door drifted the familiar scent of flour and coffee and cured meat, the kind of smell that could make an empty stomach tighten without asking permission. Clara adjusted the strap of her sack over her shoulder and walked toward it, each step measured, not slow, not hurried, just deliberate, the way a person walks when they've learned that hesitation invites questions they can't afford to answer. Inside, the store was warmer, the air thick with the low murmur of conversation and the soft clink of jars being set back on shelves, and, for a moment, no one paid her any mind, which might have been a kindness if it had lasted. But it didn't take long for a few glances to settle, for the shape of her worn dress and the thinness of her belongings to speak louder than any introduction she might have offered. She moved toward the counter, fingers brushing lightly over a sack of flour, then a small tin of coffee, her touch careful, like she understood the value of things that didn't belong to her yet. And when she finally reached into her pocket, the coin she drew out rested in her palm with a quiet weight that said more about her journey than any story she might tell. She didn't look around to see who was watching, didn't shrink under the attention that had begun to gather, just placed the coins gently on the worn wood of the counter as if that simple act carried a kind of dignity no one else could take from her. And in that moment, before a single word had been spoken, before any laughter or judgment had a chance to rise, there was something steady in the way she stood there, something that said she wasn't asking to be saved, only to be treated like she had a place in the world, even if the world hadn't agreed just yet. Mr. Harlan Pike did not reach for the coins right away, and that small pause carried more weight than a louder man might have managed with a raised voice, his eyes moving from the worn edges of Clara Whitcomb's sleeve to the modest spread of change on the counter, then back again as if he were measuring something that had nothing to do with the price of flour or coffee. He leaned forward just enough for the lamplight to catch the lines in his face, the kind etched there by years of deciding who was worth his time and who was not. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried across the store with a clarity that invited attention rather than avoided it. "That all you have, miss?" he said, not unkindly in tone, but not kindly either, the question hanging in the air like it already knew its own answer. Clara did not pull her hand back, did not gather the coins as though embarrassed by them. She simply nodded once, and said, "I am hoping it might be enough for a small sack of flour and a bit of coffee, whatever you can spare at that price." And there was something in the way she said spare that was not a plea, but a practical acknowledgement of limits, the kind a person learns when they have gone without long enough to understand the difference between wanting and needing. A man near the pickle barrel shifted his weight, the boards creaking under his boots, and a woman by the fabric bolts tilted her head ever so slightly, her attention now fully given, because moments like this did not pass through a place like Pike's store without leaving a mark. Mr. Pike let out a breath through his nose, slow, measured, and then reached for the coins at last, lifting them between his fingers and letting them clink together with a sound just loud enough to carry, not quite mockery, not quite sympathy, something in between that made it difficult to answer without stepping into the very thing it suggested. "Flour's gone up," he said, turning slightly so others could hear without appearing to address them directly. Coffee, too. And I do not run a charity house, in case that was not made clear when you walked in. And there it was, laid plain but dressed in a way that let him pretend it was only business. Clara's fingers tightened just slightly against the edge of the counter, the smallest movement, one most would have missed, and she drew in a quiet breath before responding. I am not asking for charity, sir. Only for the cost of what I can pay. Her voice steady, not raised, not lowered, simply present in a way that did not invite pity or argument. For a moment Mr. Pike studied her, as if deciding whether to press further or let the matter pass. And in that space the room seemed to lean in, the air thick with the kind of curiosity that does not belong to the person being watched, but to those doing the watching. From the far side of the store, near the stacked barrels of feed, a man in a dust-worn coat had gone still, his hand resting loosely against the rim of a crate, his hat pulled low enough to shadow his eyes, and though no one had taken note of him. When he entered, there was something in the way he stood now that suggested he had been paying attention longer than anyone realized. Clara did not look in his direction, did not seek an ally or an exit. She only kept her gaze on the counter and the man behind it, waiting, not impatiently, but with the quiet resolve of someone who had decided that whatever came next would be met on her feet rather than avoided altogether. And outside the wind lifted a thin veil of dust along the road, pressing it briefly against the window before letting it fall away again, as if the world itself were holding its breath to see what kind of place this would prove to be. Mr. Pike did not lower the coins back to the counter, not yet, and that small decision seemed to stretch the moment longer than it needed to be, his fingers turning the pieces as though their value might change if examined from a different angle, while the room held its quiet in a way that was no longer casual but expectant, like folks had settled in to watch how far a thing might go. You say you are not asking for charity, he went on, his voice carrying just enough to reach the corners without sounding like a shout. But you walk in here with not even enough for a proper measure, and you expect me to what? Cut the price down because you asked polite. And there was a faint curl at the edge of his mouth that suggested he found something about the situation more amusing than troubling. Clara Whitcomb did not answer right away, her gaze dropping for a brief second to the coins still held above the counter, then lifting again to meet his without challenge, but without retreat either, and when she spoke her tone stayed even, like she was placing each word carefully where it belonged. I expect you to tell me what those coins will buy, sir, and I will decide from there, she said, and there was something in that answer that did not invite negotiation so much as it drew a quiet line, one that said she would not step beyond what she could stand behind later. A low chuckle came from somewhere near the door, quickly stifled but not entirely hidden, and the woman by the fabric. Bolts shifted again, her fingers tracing the edge of a folded cloth as if she needed something to do with her hands while she listened. Mr. Pike raised his eyebrows slightly, as though the reply had not gone the way he expected, and he leaned back just enough to let the coins fall from his fingers onto the wood with a soft clatter that echoed more than it should have. That will buy you near nothing worth carrying out, he said, tapping the counter once with his knuckle. Not in this store, not with prices as they stand. So you have yourself a choice. Miss, you can take what little that is and be on your way, or you can put in a bit of work, sweep the floor, tidy the shelves, and I might see about letting you leave with something more useful than empty hands. The offer hung there, shaped like opportunity but carrying the weight of something else, something that asked not only for labor, but for a kind of acceptance that Clara understood without needing it explained, and for a moment the only sound was the faint tick of a clock somewhere behind the shelves and the soft shifting of boots on worn boards. She glanced once at the broom propped in the corner, then back to the man behind the counter, and though her shoulders were narrow beneath the damp fabric of her dress, they did not fold inward, did not lower in the way of someone preparing to agree just to be done with it. I will work for a fair wage, she said quietly, and I will pay for what I take, but I do not take what is given to me as if I had no say in the matter. And there was no heat in her voice, no accusation, only a statement set down plain and steady, like a fact that did not require defending. The chuckle by the door did not return, and the woman by the fabric bolts let her hand fall still, her attention now fixed fully on the exchange, while from the far side of the store the man in the dust-worn coat shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, his gaze still hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but his attention unmistakably anchored to the woman at the counter, as if he were listening not just to what was said, but to what it revealed beneath the words. Mr. Pike's expression tightened just a fraction, the faint amusement thinning into something more measured, and he rested both hands on the counter, leaning forward again as though reconsidering the shape of the moment. "Pride is a fine thing to carry," he said, his tone softer now, but no less pointed, "until it leaves you with nothing else." And he let the words sit between them, waiting to see if she would bend or hold, while outside the wind shifted again, brushing the side of the building with a low, steady sound that seemed to echo the quiet tension inside, a reminder that some things in life could not be forced to move any faster than they were willing to go. Clara Whitcomb did not answer that last remark right away, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood that some words, once spoken, could not be taken back, and she had learned long ago to spend them carefully, like coins that had to last longer than expected. Her hand moved slowly toward the small pile of coins on the counter, not to gather them up in defeat, but to bring them closer, her fingers resting lightly over them, as if reminding herself they were still hers to decide upon, still something she had earned in ways no one else in that room had witnessed. "Then I reckon I will carry what I can afford, even if it is not much," she said at last, her voice quiet but steady, and there was no edge in it, no challenge, only a calm acceptance that did not bend under the weight of his suggestion. She reached for the smallest sack of flour within her reach, a modest portion tied with rough twine, and set it gently on the counter beside her coins, her movements deliberate, unhurried, like she was setting the terms of her own transaction without asking permission for it. Mr. Pike watched her for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as though trying to decide whether to be irritated or impressed, and for a brief second the room seemed to hold itself in a kind of suspended silence, as if even the dust in the air had paused to see how this would settle. "That little will not carry you far," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier sharpness, the statement sounding more like an observation than a judgment this time. Clara gave a small nod, not looking up from the counter as she adjusted the twine around the sack, making sure it was secure. "It will carry me as far as I can go today," she replied, and there was something in that answer that reached beyond the flour itself, something that spoke of days measured not in comfort but in distance, in the quiet determination to keep moving even when the road offered no promise of ease. Near the door, a young boy shifted from one foot to the other, a single silver coin slipping unnoticed from his loose grip and rolling softly across the floor before coming to rest near the base of the counter, its faint metallic ring almost lost beneath the weight of the moment. Clara's gaze dropped at the sound, and for a heartbeat she simply looked at it, the shine of the coin catching the light in a way that made it seem larger than it was, more significant, like a small piece of luck placed just within reach. No one else seemed to notice, not at first, their attention still fixed on the quiet exchange at the counter, and the boy, distracted by something outside the window, had not yet realized what he had lost. Clara bent slightly, her fingers closing around the coin with care, and when she straightened, she did not slip it into her pocket or hide it away. She simply turned and held it out toward the boy. "I believe this belongs to you," she said, her voice carrying just enough to reach him without drawing unnecessary attention, and the boy blinked in surprise before stepping forward to take it, his small hand closing around the silver with a quick, grateful nod. For a brief moment, something shifted in the room, not loudly, not enough to change the air entirely, but enough that a few of the watching faces lost their easy amusement, replaced by something quieter, more thoughtful. Mr. Pike let out a short breath, one that might have been a faint laugh or something close to it, though it did not carry the same sharpness as before. "Seems you are richer in honesty than in coin," he remarked, not quite mocking now, but not entirely free of it either, and Clara met his gaze just once, her expression unchanged, before sliding her coins forward across the counter. "Honesty does not buy flour," she said simply, "but it lets a person sleep when the day is done." And with that she stood waiting, not asking for anything more than what she had already chosen, while from the far side of the store the man in the dust-worn coat lifted his head just slightly, his attention sharpening in a way that suggested this small moment had told him more than all the words spoken before it. Mr. Pike gathered the coins at last, Not with the earlier display, but with a quieter motion, as though the small exchange had taken some of the performance out of him, and he weighed them once more in his palm before nodding toward the modest sack Clara had set aside. "That will cover the flour," he said, his voice even now, almost businesslike, and he pulled the sack closer, tightening the twine with a practiced hand before sliding it back across the counter toward her, the wood giving a soft scrape beneath it. Clara Whitcomb reached for it with both hands, not hurried, not hesitant, simply taking hold of what she had paid for, her fingers pressing lightly into the rough fabric as if measuring its weight, as if confirming to herself that this small thing was enough for now. She did not ask again about the coffee, did not try to stretch the moment into something more than it was, and that quiet restraint seemed to settle into the room in a way that no raised voice ever could. Near the door, the boy who had taken back his coin stood a little straighter, watching her with a kind of attention that children give when they have seen something they do not yet have words for, while the woman by the fabric bolts lowered her gaze, smoothing the cloth in her hands though her thoughts appeared elsewhere. Mr. Pike rested his forearms on the counter, his fingers tapping once, then stilling, and for a moment he looked as though he might say something further, perhaps offer a different kind of bargain, but whatever thought crossed his mind did not make its way into words. "You will not last long on that," he said instead, not unkindly now, more like a man stating the weather, and Clara gave a small nod in return, lifting the sack and tucking it close against her side. "I have lasted this far," she replied, and there was no pride in it, no attempt to prove anything, only a quiet acknowledgement of the road already behind her. She turned then, her movement simple and unremarkable, and began to make her way toward the door, her boots sounding softly against the boards, each step steady, each one carrying her out of the circle of attention that had gathered around her without ever quite touching her. The bell above the door gave a light, familiar chime as she reached for it, the sound cutting gently through the room, and for a brief moment the ordinary rhythm of the store seemed to return, as though the moment had passed, and things might settle back into their usual shape. But near the feed barrels, the man in the dust-worn coat did not return to whatever task had brought him there, his gaze following Clara as she moved, not in a way that drew notice, but in a way that held quiet intent, like a man who had been waiting for something and had just seen it arrive. His hand lifted slightly from the crate, fingers brushing away a thin layer of dust that clung there, and he straightened just enough for the lamplight to catch the edge of his jaw beneath the brim of his hat. Mr. Pike noticed the movement then, his eyes shifting past the departing figure of Clara to the man who had remained silent through it all, and there was a flicker of recognition there, the kind reserved for someone known by reputation more than by conversation. "You need anything else, Boone?" he called, his tone carrying a different note now, one of careful respect threaded through the familiarity, and the man answered without raising his voice, his words low but clear. "Reckon I do," he said, his gaze still on the door that had just closed, the faint echo of its chime lingering in the air. "Go ahead and add another sack of flour, coffee, sugar, and whatever else a person might need for a week's stay." And though he did not say who it was for, there was something in the way he spoke that shifted the weight of the room once more, quiet but certain, like a decision made long before anyone else realized it was being considered. Outside, the air carried that thin edge of mountain chill that lingered even when the sun tried to hold its ground, and Clara Whitcomb stepped down from the wooden porch with the small sack of flour held close against her side, the weight of it modest but certain, the kind of weight a person could measure a day by. The street stretched quiet in front of her, dust shifting in low patterns across the packed earth, a few wagons standing idle along the edge, their wheels marked by the slow passing of time rather than hurry. And for a moment she paused, not because she did not know where to go, but because she was deciding how far she could carry herself before needing to stop. She adjusted the strap of her canvas sack again, her fingers brushing over the worn fabric as if grounding herself in something familiar, then stepped forward, her boots finding their rhythm along the road, steady and unremarkable, like she had done this before in places that did not remember her name. Behind her, the door of the store opened once more, though she did not turn to look, the sound of the bell softer now, less a call for attention and more a passing note in the day's quiet music. Inside, Mr. Pike had already begun gathering the items requested, though not without a glance toward the man who had made them, his movements carrying a careful efficiency that came from understanding when a transaction was more than a simple exchange. "You planning to feed the whole ridge with that order?" he said, tying off a larger sack of flour, his tone lighter but edged with curiosity that had not entirely left him. Elias Boone did not answer right away, his gaze resting on the open doorway as if measuring distance rather than listening to the question, and when he did speak it was with the same low steadiness that had marked him from the start. "Just enough for someone who ought not be counting every crumb," he said, and there was no emphasis placed on the words, no attempt to make them carry further than they needed to, but they settled into the space all the same. Mr. Pike paused in his work for a fraction of a second, then nodded once, as if accepting an explanation that required no further probing, and he set the remaining items onto the counter: coffee wrapped in paper, a small sack of sugar, a length of cloth, simple things that spoke of use rather than comfort. Elias stepped forward then, reaching into his coat to place a folded bill beside the goods, not counting it out piece by piece, but leaving it there with the quiet assurance of a man who did not need to be told what things cost. "Send it out with my rig," he added, his hand resting briefly on the edge of the counter before he turned toward the door, his boots sounding soft but deliberate against the boards, each step carrying the weight of a decision already made. Outside, Clara had made her way halfway down the street, her pace unhurried but consistent, her gaze fixed ahead rather than on the passing faces that marked her movement with brief, passing looks, and though she did not know it, the distance between her and the store was already being measured by someone else with a different kind of intent. The door opened again behind her, the bell giving its familiar chime, and this time the sound carried just a little farther, reaching her without asking her to turn, without demanding her attention, simply existing there as part of the world she was walking through. Elias Boone stepped out into the light, the brim of his hat casting a shadow across his face, his eyes settling on the figure ahead of him with a quiet certainty, and for a moment he stood there, not calling out, not rushing forward, just watching the way she carried that small sack as though it mattered, the way she moved as though the road itself was something she had already agreed to face. Then, with no more hesitation than a man might show when setting out toward a known path, he stepped down from the porch and followed, not closing the distance yet, not announcing himself, only moving in the same direction, his presence steady and unspoken, like something that had been there longer than anyone had noticed. The road did not offer much in the way of direction, only a gradual thinning of buildings as Clara Whitcomb walked on, the town giving way to open stretches where the wind moved more freely and the sounds of voices faded into something distant and indistinct, and still she kept her pace steady, the small sack of flour tucked close as if it were enough to anchor her in a place that had not yet decided whether to keep her or let her pass through. She did not look back, not when the store disappeared behind her, not when the last of the familiar structures slipped from view, because she had learned that looking back too often made a person doubt the ground ahead, and doubt was a luxury she could not afford. The sky stretched wide above, pale and open, the kind that made a person feel both small and strangely free at the same time, and the path beneath her boots turned from packed street to a more uncertain trail, marked by wagon tracks that led toward the hills in the distance. A breeze moved through, carrying with it the faint scent of pine from higher ground, and Clara drew in a quiet breath, not deep enough to call it relief, but enough to steady something inside her that had been holding tight since she stepped into that store. Behind her, Elias Boone followed at a distance that was neither hidden nor obvious, his steps measured in a way that matched her pace without crowding it, as though he understood that some approaches needed time to settle before they were made. He watched the way she carried herself more than the road she walked, noting how she adjusted the weight of the flour without complaint, how she shifted her shoulders just enough to keep her balance even when the ground grew uneven, small things that spoke of a life spent adapting rather than expecting ease. A pair of riders passed along the far edge of the trail, their conversation low and carried away by the wind, their attention barely brushing over Clara before moving on, and she did not slow, did not turn her head, only kept her gaze forward as if she had already decided that whatever lay ahead would be met without hesitation. The town behind them settled back into its usual rhythm, the moment in the store already becoming something half remembered, but out here the quiet was different, not the kind that watched and judged, but the kind that simply existed, open and waiting. Clara reached a point where the trail split, one path leading toward a cluster of low buildings near a stand of cottonwoods, the other winding upward toward the darker line of the mountain ridge, and she paused there, not uncertain exactly, but considering, her eyes moving from one path to the other as if weighing not just distance, but what each direction might ask of her. The flower shifted slightly in her arms, and she adjusted her hold, her fingers tightening briefly against the rough fabric before easing again, a small motion that carried more thought than words might have. Elias slowed his steps then, not closing the space between them, giving her that moment as if it belonged to her alone, his gaze steady beneath the brim of his hat, watching without pressing, waiting without calling out. The wind moved again, lifting a strand of her hair loose from its pin, and Clara brushed it back absently, her hand lingering for just a second at the side of her neck before falling away. Then, with a quiet resolve that had nothing to do with certainty and everything to do with choice, she stepped toward the path that led up toward the ridge, her boots finding the incline without hesitation, and though she did not know it, the man behind her had already decided that whatever road she chose would be the one he followed, not out of obligation, not out of impulse, but because something in the way she walked had made that decision feel as steady as the ground beneath his feet. The trail began to rise in a slow, steady climb, not steep enough to stop a person, but enough to remind them with every step that they were leaving something behind, and Clara Whitcomb felt that shift not in her breath, but in the way the ground pressed differently beneath her boots, firmer in some places, loose in others, asking her to pay attention in a way the flat road never had. She adjusted the sack of flour again, this time shifting it slightly higher against her side, her arm tightening just enough to keep it from slipping as the incline grew more noticeable, and though the weight had not changed, it seemed to settle deeper into her muscles, the kind of weight that did not complain but did not forget either. The wind moved differently up here, carrying less dust and more of that quiet mountain scent, pine and stone, and something cooler that settled against her skin like a promise she had not yet decided to believe. She walked on without looking back, her gaze fixed on the narrow line of the trail ahead, where it curved between low brush and scattered rocks, leading toward a ridge that seemed farther than it should have been, as though distance in this place did not measure itself the same way it did in town. Behind her, Elias Boone followed with that same steady patience, his boots finding the path with ease born of familiarity, though his attention remained on the woman ahead of him rather than the land itself, watching the small adjustments she made, the way she slowed slightly at uneven ground, the way she did not stop even when the climb asked more of her than the flat road had. A gust of wind moved through then, stronger than before, catching at the edge of Clara's skirt and pulling loose strands of her hair free again, and she paused for just a moment, not to rest, but to steady herself, her hand lifting to hold the sack closer as the fabric shifted against her arm. It was in that pause that she seemed to feel something else, not a sound exactly, but a presence, the faint awareness that she was no longer entirely alone on the trail, and though she did not turn right away, there was a subtle change in the way she stood, a slight stillness that had not been there before. Elias saw it, recognized it for what it was, and after a moment that stretched just long enough to matter, he closed the distance between them by a few measured steps, not enough to startle, but enough that his presence could no longer be mistaken for distance or chance. "Trail gets rougher past the next bend," he said, his voice low and even, carrying easily in the open air without pressing against it, and Clara turned then, her eyes meeting his for the first time since she had stepped out of the store, her expression neither surprised nor unsettled, simply aware. She took in the sight of him in a single glance, the dust-worn coat, the brim of his hat, the quiet steadiness in the way he stood, and then her gaze shifted briefly to the trail behind him before returning forward again. "I figured as much," she replied, her voice calm, not defensive, not welcoming either, just acknowledging what had already become clear. Elias gave a small nod, as if that answer confirmed something he had already guessed, and he did not step closer, did not reach for the sack she carried or offer to take it, only stood there a moment longer, letting the space between them settle into something that did not need to be filled with more words. The wind eased again, the trail stretching ahead in quiet patience, and Clara turned back toward it without waiting, her steps resuming with the same steady rhythm, while Elias fell into place a short distance beside and behind her, not leading, not following too closely, just present in a way that felt less like interruption and more like something that had found its place without needing to ask. The path narrowed as it climbed, the loose gravel giving way to firmer ground broken by roots and flat stones that seemed placed there by time rather than design, and Clara Whitcomb adjusted her steps to match it without comment. Her pace steady though the incline asked more of her with every yard. The small sack of flour pressed into her side, its weight no longer just a measure of food but of effort, something earned and carried forward, and she shifted it once more, not out of discomfort but out of habit, the kind that came from knowing how to move with what you had rather than against it. Beside and slightly behind her, Elias Boone walked with the ease of someone who knew the land well enough not to look down at every step, his attention moving between the trail and the quiet figure ahead, taking note of the way she did not rush, did not slow unnecessarily, only matched the rhythm of the climb as if she had already accepted what it required. For a while, neither of them spoke, the silence between them not empty but settled, like something that had found its place without needing to be named, and the only sounds were the soft scrape of boots on earth and the distant call of a hawk circling somewhere above the ridge. After a time, the trail curved around a low outcrop of rock, opening to a wider stretch where the land dipped slightly before rising again, and Clara paused there, not out of fatigue, but to shift the sack more securely against her arm, her fingers pressing briefly into the coarse fabric before easing again. Elias stepped forward just enough to close the gap a little, his presence now unmistakable but still unforced, and he spoke without looking directly at her, his voice low and even. "There is a spring about half a mile up," he said, nodding slightly toward the path ahead. "Water runs clear this time of year." Clara glanced in the direction he indicated, then back at the trail beneath her feet, considering the words not as an offer, but as information, something she could choose to use or not. "I appreciate the telling," she replied after a moment, her tone calm, neither warm nor distant, simply acknowledging what had been given. Elias gave a small nod, as though that was enough, and did not add to it, letting the quiet settle again as they resumed their steps, the distance between them now closer but still respectful, like two people walking the same road, without claiming it from one another. A breeze moved through the trees above, carrying the faint sound of water somewhere ahead, just enough to confirm his words, and Clara lifted her gaze slightly, the first sign of something like relief passing through her expression, though it was subtle, the kind that did not linger long enough to be easily seen. They walked on in that shared silence, the trail bending gently upward, and after a few more minutes the sound of water grew clearer, a soft, steady trickle over stone, and the trees opened just enough to reveal a small spring tucked against the base of a rock face, its surface catching the light in a quiet shimmer. Clara stepped toward it without hesitation, kneeling carefully to set the sack of flour on a dry patch of ground before cupping her hands beneath the flow, the cool water slipping through her fingers before she lifted it to her lips, drinking slowly, deliberately, as though reminding herself that she did not need to rush even this. Elias remained a short distance away, not approaching the spring immediately, giving her the space as if it were something she had reached on her own, his hands resting loosely at his sides as he watched the simple act of her drinking, the way she paused afterward, her shoulders easing just slightly as the strain of the climb settled into something more manageable. When she stood again, she wiped her hands lightly against her skirt, then reached for the sack once more, lifting it with the same steady care as before, and for the first time since he had spoken, she looked at him fully, her gaze meeting his without hesitation. "You did not have to follow," she said, not as a question, not as a challenge, but as a simple statement laid between them like the trail itself, and Elias held her gaze for a moment before answering, his voice carrying the same quiet certainty that had marked him from the start. "No," he said, "but I figured you might not mind the company once the road turned uphill," and there was no insistence in it, no expectation, only a possibility offered and left where she could take it or leave it, and Clara considered him for a moment longer before turning back toward the path, her steps resuming without another word, though the space between them now felt less like distance and more like something that had begun, quietly, to close. The trail beyond the spring rose more sharply, the earth giving way to patches of stone that held the warmth of the afternoon sun, and Clara Whitcomb stepped onto it without hesitation. Though the climb now asked more from her shoulders and her breath, the sack of flour pressing heavier against her side with each upward step. She did not slow, not in any way that would suggest struggle, but the rhythm of her movement shifted just enough to show the effort beneath it, the quiet kind that did not ask for notice. Elias Boone walked alongside now, not quite beside her, but no longer behind, his presence settling into a place that felt less like following and more like sharing the path. His gaze moving once toward the sack she carried before returning to the ground ahead. "You can set it on my saddle when we reach the ridge," he said after a moment, his tone even, offered without insistence. "Let's wait for the last stretch." Clara shook her head lightly, not turning to face him, her eyes still fixed on the trail. "I have carried it this far," she replied. "I can carry it the rest," and there was no stubbornness in the words, only a simple truth she had already decided upon. Elias did not argue, did not repeat the offer, only gave a small nod as if he understood that some things were not about ease, but about finishing what had been started. The path curved again, narrowing between two outcroppings of rock, and beyond them the land opened just enough to reveal a higher line of trees marking the edge of the ridge, their branches moving gently in the wind, a quiet promise of shade and rest beyond the climb. Clara's steps remained steady, though her fingers tightened once against the fabric of the sack, a brief acknowledgement of the strain that passed as quickly as it came, and she adjusted her hold again, shifting the weight just enough to continue without breaking her pace. The silence between them returned, but it no longer carried the same distance as before. Now it felt shared, like something both of them understood without needing to fill it with words. A bird lifted from the brush nearby, its wings cutting through the air with a sudden sound before settling again farther up the slope, and Clara glanced toward it for a moment before returning her focus to the ground ahead, her breath measured, her posture unchanged. As they neared the ridge, the incline eased slightly, the ground leveling just enough to allow for longer steps, and Clara exhaled a quiet breath she had not realized she was holding, her shoulders lowering just a fraction as the effort shifted into something more manageable. Elias stepped ahead then by a single pace, not to lead, but to move alongside more evenly, his hand lifting briefly to point toward a break in the trees. "That is where the trail meets the ridge," he said. "After that, it is easier going." Clara followed his gesture with her eyes, taking in the path ahead, the line of trees, the open sky beyond them, and for a moment she simply stood there, not stopping entirely, but allowing herself a brief pause that felt earned rather than needed. "You know this land well," she said quietly, not looking at him, but speaking the observation as if it were part of the air between them. Elias rested his hands loosely at his sides, his gaze moving over the ridge as if it held something familiar to him, well enough to know where it gives and where it does not. He replied, and there was something in that answer that reached beyond the land itself, something that carried the weight of years spent learning more than just the shape of the ground. Clara nodded once, then resumed her steps, crossing the last stretch toward the ridge, the sack of flour still in her arms, the path ahead opening wider with each step, and as she moved into the shade of the trees, the light shifting around her, Elias followed without hesitation, the space between them now quiet, steady, and no longer uncertain, like a road that had begun without either of them fully realizing it. The ridge opened wider than Clara Whitcomb had expected, the line of trees thinning into a stretch of open ground where the wind moved more freely, carrying with it the scent of pine and distant water, and for the first time since she had left the town behind, the air felt different, not lighter exactly, but less crowded, as though it did not press in on her the same way. She stepped forward into that space, her boots finding the flatter ground with a quiet relief that she did not show in her posture, though the subtle easing of her shoulders suggested it all the same, and she shifted the sack of flour once more, this time not out of necessity, but out of habit, as if reminding herself it was still there, still something she had chosen to carry. Elias Boone walked a step closer now, no longer keeping distance out of caution, but not closing it entirely either, his presence steady at her side, without demanding attention, and he glanced toward the far end of the ridge where the land dipped gently before rising again into higher ground. "There is a cabin about a mile past that bend," he said, his voice low, carrying easily in the open air. "Not much, but it keeps the weather out and has a stove that still holds heat." Clara followed his gaze, her eyes tracing the line he indicated, though from where she stood she could not yet see the structure itself, only the shape of the land that might hold it, and she remained quiet for a moment, weighing the words not as an offer, but as something placed before her to consider. "Does it belong to you?" she asked after a pause, her tone neutral, not assuming, not dismissing, simply seeking the truth of it. Elias nodded once, his eyes still on the ridge ahead. "It does," he said, and there was no pride in the statement, no attempt to make it more than it was, just a fact laid out plainly. Clara drew in a slow breath, the wind catching lightly at her skirt again, and she looked down briefly at the sack in her arms before lifting her gaze back to the path ahead. "And what would you ask in return?" she said, not turning to him, her voice steady. "For a place under that roof." Elias did not answer immediately, his silence stretching just long enough to show that he had heard the question in full, not just the words but what lay behind them, and when he spoke his tone remained even, unhurried. "Work," he said. "Honest work, the kind that keeps a place running and a person fed. Nothing more than that, nothing less." Clara considered that, her steps slowing slightly as the thought settled, not stopping, but allowing the moment to take its place alongside the rhythm of her movement, and she nodded once, almost to herself. "I do not take charity," she said quietly, "but I will work for what I earn." Elias glanced at her then, his gaze steady, not searching for weakness or doubt, only acknowledging what she had already made clear. "I did not figure you would," he replied, and there was something in the way he said it that carried a quiet certainty, as if her answer had been known to him before she spoke it. They walked on together across the ridge, the distance between them now settled into something that did not need defining, the open land stretching out ahead, and as they moved toward the bend he had pointed out, the light shifting slightly with the lowering sun, there was a sense, quiet but certain, that the road beneath their feet had changed from something passing into something that might, in time, become a place to stay. The bend in the ridge came into view slowly, the land curving in a way that hid what lay beyond until the last few steps brought it into sight, and when Clara Whitcomb rounded it, she saw the cabin Elias Boone had spoken of, set back against a line of trees as though it had grown there rather than been built, its wood weathered to a soft gray that matched the stone around it. Simple in structure, but steady in the way it stood. She paused without meaning to, her gaze taking it in, not with wonder, not with expectation, but with a quiet measuring that came from knowing how much a place could matter when there was no other waiting for you. The chimney rose straight, a faint trace of smoke barely visible against the sky, suggesting a fire that had been tended recently, and the door stood closed but not guarded, the kind of place that did not need to prove itself to anyone passing by. Clara shifted the sack of flour once more, her arms feeling the climb now in a deeper way, not enough to stop her, but enough that the sight of a place to set it down settled into her with a quiet acknowledgement. She stepped forward again, closing the remaining distance without hurry, her boots sounding softer now against the ground that had been worn by fewer feet than the road below. Elias walked beside her, not ahead, not guiding, only present, his gaze moving briefly over the cabin as if confirming what he already knew, then returning to her, watching not for weakness, but for choice. Clara reached the small porch and set the sack down at last, her hands lingering on it for a moment before she straightened, her shoulders easing in a way that spoke not of relief alone, but of something set aside, even if only for now. She did not step inside, did not reach for the door. Instead she turned slightly, her eyes meeting his with the same steady calm she had carried from the beginning. "You said a week," she said, her voice even, not questioning the offer but marking its terms. "A week of work, and I pay what I owe." Elias gave a small nod, resting one hand lightly against the porch rail, his posture relaxed but attentive. "A week," he confirmed. "And after that, you decide if you stay or go, no one holds you either way." Clara considered that, her gaze shifting briefly to the door, then back to him, and for a moment there was a quiet stillness between them, not uncertain, but deliberate, as though both understood that something had been set in motion that did not need to be named aloud. "Then I will start now," she said, and there was no hesitation in it, no delay to rest longer than needed, only the simple acceptance of what she had chosen. She reached for the door and pushed it open, the hinges giving a soft sound that spoke of use rather than neglect, and inside the cabin the air held the faint warmth of a recent fire, the space modest but ordered, a table set near the window, a stove in the corner, 2 chairs that had been used enough to know their purpose. Clara stepped inside without waiting for invitation, not as someone claiming the space, but as someone willing to earn her place within it, her hand brushing lightly against the edge of the table as she moved, as if learning its shape. Elias remained just outside for a moment, watching the way she entered, not with uncertainty, but with quiet purpose, and then he stepped in after her, closing the door gently behind him, the sound settling into the small room like the beginning of something that did not need to be rushed, only lived one step at a time. The cabin settled into a quiet rhythm as the light shifted toward evening, the kind of slow change that did not announce itself, but could be felt in the way the air cooled and the shadows stretched longer across the wooden floor, and Clara Whitcomb moved through the small space with a steadiness that came not from familiarity, but from intention, her hands finding simple tasks without needing instruction, setting the sack of flour near the stove, brushing a thin layer of dust from the table, opening the small window just enough to let the mountain air move through. She did not ask where things belonged. She learned by looking, by noticing the worn edges, the places where use had shaped the room, and in that quiet way she began to make sense of it, not as her own, but as something she could care for. Elias Boone watched for a time without speaking, his presence near the doorway, his hat set aside now, his hands resting loosely at his sides, and there was no urgency in him, no need to direct or correct, only a quiet attention that followed her movements as if they told him more than words might have. When she reached the stove, she paused, her fingers brushing lightly over its surface, testing the warmth that still lingered there, and she opened the small compartment with care, adding a piece of kindling from the stack beside it, her movements deliberate, practiced in a way that suggested she had done this before in places that had not belonged to her either. The fire caught slowly, the faint crackle filling the room with a soft sound that settled into the space like a promise of something steady, and Clara stood for a moment watching it, her shoulders easing just slightly as the warmth began to build again. "You keep it well," she said after a while, her voice low, not turning to face him, her attention still on the fire as it took hold. Elias shifted his weight slightly, his gaze moving to the stove, then back to her. "I keep it enough," he replied, and there was a hint of something unspoken in the words, not regret, not pride, simply the acknowledgement that a place could be maintained without ever feeling fully lived in. Clara nodded once, as if she understood that distinction, and she moved to the small shelf near the wall, straightening a folded cloth, setting a cup upright where it had been left on its side, small things that did not change the room, but gave it a different kind of order. The light outside softened further, the sky turning a pale gold through the window, and the cabin held that quiet in a way that did not press, only surrounded, and for a while neither of them spoke, the silence now something shared rather than uncertain. After a time, Clara reached into her canvas sack and drew out a small piece of cloth-wrapped bread she had carried from before, setting it on the table with care, then looking once toward Elias, not asking, not offering with words, just placing it there between them as something simple and sufficient. Elias stepped forward then, his boots quiet against the floor, and he took the seat across from her without hesitation, the table between them holding not much more than that small piece of bread and the warmth of the fire, and for the first time since the road had brought them together, the space felt less like a stopping point and more like the beginning of something that did not need to be named. Clara broke the bread in two, setting one half closer to him, then taking her own, and they ate in that same quiet, the kind that carried meaning without needing to fill itself with words, and outside the last of the light slipped behind the ridge, leaving the cabin in a soft glow that came from within, the fire steady, the air warm, and the simple presence of two people who had chosen, in their own ways, not to turn away.